Hello and welcome to the Volleycast. I am your host, Joe Trinzi. And on the other line, we got the Malibu duo, David Hunt and Andrew Strick. How you doing, guys?
What's up, Joe?
What's up?
Just another day in quarantine here. And it feels like it's been going on forever, but it's been like 2 weeks.
So. Yeah, 2 weeks. And I think they're going to announce pretty soon that we got like 30 more days of it. So,
yeah. For any volleyball coach, it's way too long out of the gym, but we can connect virtually. I've got our new old Volleycast background here for anybody who's watching on YouTube. It's just fantastic work of art, modern technology.
There you go.
It's really pretty amazing, actually. I don't know, just how we're not too long from being able to play volleyball without ever having to actually go on a court, and we can just somehow simulate the actions of the ball. And then we'll all be worthless as coaches.
Yeah, pretty much.
When esports takes over. Anyway, that's a brilliant introduction to this podcast. Just a couple more notes. We got the Chris Thomas webinar coming up on Friday, our next premium webinar. As of this recording, we're recording this on Monday night. We'll put it out on Tuesday morning. There's 3 spots left. So if you go on scoutvb.com, you may be able to get one of those last couple spots. Otherwise, just stay posted. And look, I know we got it's an awesome time because we got a lot of great coaches right now with time on their hands to do some of these webinars and connect with some people. And as soon as they get back in the gym, somebody like Chris Thomas, head coach of Illinois, it's going to be too busy maybe to get on some of these webinars. But now's a great time, and we're keeping those spots limited so we can have a lot of personal interaction, a lot of questions. It's a good time for all that stuff. And speaking of the webinars, yesterday, from when we were recording this, so that was Sunday, we had our nerdiest webinar out there with myself and Jeff Liu, the data analytics, statistics kind of special there. Kind of like a brainstorm Q&A. Jeff and I presented some of our thoughts on using analytics and studying the game of volleyball and some frameworks there. And then just a lot of kind of Q&A brainstorming from other coaches who are using this time to study their season and study their players and try to have some new takeaways that they can come in and make their practice time more efficient. That was something that we have been talking about, especially for coaches on the women's side who are hoping to get into their fall season, assuming that we can kind of get into it. I think at the very least, they can count on athletes not having as much preparation between the spring and the summer. I mean, certainly we're already there with spring seasons getting canceled. Athletes probably won't be able to have the same level of preparation on over the summer. So how can we make things more efficient in the fall? And this topic came up as it relates specifically to statistics. It was basically like, hey, what stats should we share with our athletes? Should we just share everybody's stats? Should we just share their specific stats? Should we only share some stats? We should not share any stats with the players, So we can talk about that from a more limited perspective of statistical information. But then I think there's even the broader question of what information do athletes need to know to play the game well? And what do coaches need to know? And how much overlap is there? So maybe, Dave, I just want to kind of hear your thought on the stats end. With your Pepperdine guys, what stats information do you share with them? And what do you keep to yourself? And how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, well, you guys would be the first 2 people I would call if we were chatting about this. So it's nice that you guys are right here. For us, I think it depends on the phase of the season. And for sure, in match, I don't want our athletes thinking anything about numbers. I want them just competing. But then maybe post-match or even during the fall during our preseason, there are some standards that we have to talk about and certain benchmarks we're going to have to meet if we want to be a national championship contender. So I do think we're aware of those. How much we want our athletes aware of them? Probably not so much in terms of while they're out there performing. I think it's just mainly maybe during our weekly meetings, we're touching on here's why they're going to focus on what they're going to focus on for the upcoming week. And here's the result that we're trying to achieve. But I think we'd all agree that when we're performing our best, we're not necessarily thinking about our passing number, our hitting efficiency. We're just out there in the moment performing our skill. So I wouldn't want the athletes on the court thinking about that too much.
What are your thoughts, Andrew?
Just from a motor learning perspective, when it comes to statistical information as far as progress is concerned in the training area or the practice environment, what we found is that if you can share statistics that lead to the idea that the athletes are better than average at improvement, they actually will improve even more than if you told them they're on average or below average compared to their peers or to other teams. So even if it's a lie, as long as it's believable to the athlete, you will see more improvements in their game.
So you're talking about this idea of enhanced expectancy. Is that what this is connected to? One of these motor learning principles of enhanced expectancy, like if they expect that they're going to be able to do the task well, they're more likely to do it.
Correct. Yeah, that's something that Dr. Gabrielle Wolf found at University of Nevada, Las Vegas in her optimal theory of motor learning. One of those pillars was enhanced expectancies.
Yeah, just is something that just, even when I do like camps or a clinic with like a high school program, I used to start it with, okay, we're going to come in and like, we'll start camp with like exchange, just over the net exchange, back row, just keeping the ball going. And I used to just kind of roll it out there and say, okay, our goal is going to be this or that. But what I find is like, if you miss the mark a little bit, then it kind of sets you up for some like de-enhanced expectancy. Or if your team is better than that and the goal is too low, like to some degree, they'll kind of play to the goal that you set them. So now whenever I do that, I always just let them go, and kind of see what they get first. And then it's always like, well, it's not a bad start, but my experience is you can usually get this much or so, you know what I mean? Like say they get 6. It's like, well, we'll probably be able to get 18 by the end, and you kind of set them up with this goal that's more than what they can do now, but they're seeing the progress towards it. And it's like, oh, wow, like we're really giving them that feeling of like, we're really getting this. And then like the psychological thing of like, then the athletes start investing more in it when they feel like the goal is accomplishable.
Yeah, just so I can touch on that, what we're describing is two separate things. One of them is having a goal as far as what the number is, in this case of rallies over the net. And the difference between that and what Gabby Wolf found was that even if you gave them information that was false, that was alongside their improvement in the task, which is different than having an outcome goal, that their performance and therefore their learning would increase.
It's interesting, Andrew, you're touching on a topic. I listened to a podcast with Joe Madden, and I think he was sort of seen as one of the first baseball coaches to really dive into analytics. And he was discussing that he used analytics as a form to do exactly what you're describing, was to basically make his players feel like they were actually playing well, even if they weren't. So he would find a guy that's in the middle of a slump and dive into statistics to find some piece of information that's, hey, even though you're not hitting well, when you have 2 strikes on you, you're better than every hitter in the major leagues. So, don't worry about it if you're in those situations. And he found that he was able to get guys to perform better. And maybe that's exactly what you're talking about. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
I think the one balance to that is a little bit of the difference between when you're looking at some of these performances in like a laboratory setting where you're looking at short-term improvement or medium-term improvement versus like a long-range relationship with an athlete, is you don't want to go so far that you lose your trust and credibility with an athlete by like, you don't want to be like, Dave, the example you talked about, like Joe Madden is a great, where like, so he's trying to find something that's true-ish, at least. You know what I mean? It's like he's spinning the truth in whatever way he can get it to give that guy still that feeling of improvement or progress and like still have that indication, rather than like, because you don't want to lose your credibility with the players. And that's sort of like, to me, where like the real implementation, because a lot of that enhanced expectancy stuff is really interesting. Like for example, I've read about the one kind of test they did with like golfers, and they kind of painted around the golf hole in a way to create an optical illusion to make the hole look bigger or smaller. And when the hole looked bigger, the golfer shot better. Right? Am I getting that right, Strick?
That's correct. If the illusion is that the target is larger than it actually is, you will make more of whatever it is you're trying to score.
So to me, that's kind of like a great metaphor for great coaching, is like you don't make the task easier, because the task has to be what the task is. Like ultimately those golfers, if they want to win, they have to be able to sink the regulation sized hole. And like, we can't just like pull the net down to 6 feet and let our guys hit the ball straight down and like feel amazing, because then in the game they have to hit on 8 feet. Then they're going to have the rug pulled out from under them. So we can't change the task, but we have to like create these optical illusions, whether like as visual as that example of the golfer is, or like sort of with our words and with the way that we present data, can we kind of create that optical illusion to make the player feel like the task is more doable than it is.
Correct.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I put stress on the idea that we're talking about improvements of training, not their actual level of performance, because that's a huge difference towards the athlete's perception of how their ability corresponds to what future enhanced expectancies will be. So in this instance, if I'm telling Jimmy that his improvement on passing on average is better than what you've seen in the past, to Jimmy, that's very believable because you've worked with a number of volleyball players. And it's not necessarily that you're deceiving him. It may be very true. But regardless, Jimmy doesn't know what you know. So you could tell him, even if he's not improving as well as, let's say, some others in the past, it will still help Jimmy pass better.
So it's less about his perception of his performance and more about his perception of his rate of improvement.
Correct.
Okay.
So Andrew, how do you deal with the athlete that maybe they are improving at a high rate, but you get into a performance arena and it's not translating nearly as well?
Well, there's a number of different assumptions that lead to what we're talking about. Can you go more into the example so I can isolate what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, for example, maybe I know me and you have chatted a fair amount about blocking, right? And just that ingrained motor pattern. And when maybe, Joe, for example, is making a block move, and in practice, I see him make a block move to his right real well. And then in a match, maybe it's not going as well. And I'm talking to Joe a lot about, hey, your rate to improve is looking good. Your block move to your right's looking good. But just for whatever reason, we're not seeing it translate to a match. And what are some variables that we might have to work on in practice to be able to strengthen that relationship?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is that information and movement are linked. And so I think what a lot of coaches do incorrectly or assume is that by having it isolated as a skill and just focusing on just a setter without hitters or no blockers next to this middle per se, that they'll just somehow pick it up very well in that blocked section or this part practice, instead of having a more live environment where they get to practice that skill in like a 6-on-6 situation, and then exposing them to more opportunities to respond and giving them chances to correct for that behavior is very important.
Gotcha. And for correcting for that behavior, what are some ways that we would correct for that behavior?
So
More specifically, like a block move.
So yeah, let's say in this case, the block move, if they made the incorrect footwork pattern for that block move, it doesn't mean like, okay, now you're gonna make a block move to the right, because what you're trying to train is their ability to send a motor command upon a stimulus to make the correct movement. So if you have the actual player and you tell them, go to your right, they're gonna do it just fine because there's no analyzing of stimulus. I don't see the setter set. So they need to be able to see the setter set and have a live hitter there, because they're going to see that live hitter in a game. And you can't tell the setter to set that same option. You have to give them at least 1 or 2 different variables, like setting quick or setting back set. So before you go back to the outside, or maybe they go straight to the outside, it has to be random to the player.
Gotcha. But as many variables as possible to sort of make the blocker make a decision.
Correct. You need to make it as live as you can, because that's what you're trying to fix, it is in the live situation.
Gotcha.
And kind of tagging on to this in terms of like what information we're giving to players and what information do coaches have. One of the difficult things about a skill like blocking in particular is you get so little concrete information about your blocking. Less so than any other skill, except digging at some levels. Collegiate men's volleyball, you even get less about digging. And if you're like a high school girls player, you get the least information about blocking. Your serve is very easy to track and give information on and see your improvement and see your performance and all that. The blocking, it's really difficult because A, you don't block that many balls. B, the hitter has more control than the blocker does, and there's that element of randomness to it. So I don't even know if I have great answers there, but like, how do we track, let's maybe get out from this, how do we chart blocking? But like, for whatever you like to do, like, how do we chart and show that improvement or try to show that improvement with a player when it's really hard to track the results of the skill itself?
Yeah, I think you're going into this idea of outcome orientation versus a process orientation. So if for blocking specifically, since it has such a low outcome success rate, it's hard to track whether you're doing it right or wrong. And you may do it wrong and still get a good block for some reason because you're in the way. What's important, if we're talking in this example with struggling to go to the right correctly, let's say they're making a shuffle move and you want them to make a crossover move instead. You would have to track the number of times they do that crossover move correctly, even if they're late. Even if they're late, make that crossover move correctly, because then it will tell them in an outcome sense of numbers that I am improving, even though the results may not show it right away.
Yeah, so this ties to an idea. That I've called the process performance pair, and I presented on this at Training the Gap conference a few years ago, and some other things. And Dave, if you remember when I was assistant with you at Pepperdine 5 years ago now.
Yeah.
5 years ago, time's flying. This is what I was doing with some players, and for example, that's what we'd look at. So, for example, we would say, but I wanted to tie it into the actual performance. So we'd say, look at these block moves where you did this footwork, and then chart whether the hitter got a kill or not. And then look at these block moves when you did this other footwork, and then chart whether the hitter got a kill or not. And then, say we have 30 of those throughout a game, and okay, you had 20 where you did it correctly, whatever we call that. I try to even, we can touch on that. It's like, I try to even steer away from like correct and incorrect, because correct for one athlete could be incorrect for another, and so on and so forth. So I just would say like, hey, okay, when your arms came up inside your body and straight over, okay, you did that 20 times, they got 8 kills. And when your arms came outside your body and swung back around in front, then you did that 10 times and they got 7 kills. Okay, so we can see their kill percentage when you have these two different moves, for example. And so then over time, hey, we're charting A, your overall effectiveness, for example, as a blocker. And then B, we're getting some information about when your process is A or when your process is B. And I found that to be like pretty illustrative. And what I like to have is the guy to grade himself. In the beginning, you need to tell them a little bit. But what I found is then the guys were able to kind of, I'd say, okay, what do you think? Is this yes or no, or A or B, or whatever like that? And A. Okay. And then over time, I was almost just there to kind of guide them and give some feedback. And, that was such a bad move. Yeah, I know. I saw it too, or whatever it was like that, and I like that idea of the process performance pair, because then I found there was something just a lot more confident maybe about than just me telling, hey, it's important for you to come like this. And sometimes they're like, yeah, I know. But then when they can see that the real results of it in their own performance, that process leading to the improved performance, I found that to be a powerful teaching tool.
Andrew, what's the dip that we would, so say Joe's working with a blocker and he's seeing that, he's done it correctly or in the way that Joe would like it, maybe 8 out of 15 times. would we expect to see that same number in a match? Would we expect to see it drop a little bit? What are the reasons from a motor learning standpoint we would not get 100% transfer if that's accurate?
I think the idea of 100% transfer of anything is pretty false, just because to replicate the game environment, you need to actually play a game, which would be fans, stadium, refs, whatever it is you need, whistles, whatever it is. So our job as coaches is to make it as game-like as possible for our athletes so that when it comes to the game that they can get as much transfer as possible. So if an athlete doesn't have as much transfer in, particularly, let's say they're doing a 6-on-6 drill and maybe there's not as many blocking reps as they need in a certain area, you can start to see, okay, the transfer is probably, I'll make up a number, let's say it's 60%. You would have to reconstruct your practice scheduling to adjust for that. And there may be a delayed onset too, because a lot of coaches think like if I practice the day before that somehow the next day they're going to be great at it. And it's just training and practice. You see that you need time to consecutive days or a couple different practice sessions before they finally get it.
Gotcha. And what are some variables that usually have to be tweaked if we're not getting the highest rate of transfer possible?
Quality of rep is one of the biggest things based on what the data would suggest is as important. It's not just I need reps, I need quality reps, and feedback is the second biggest predictor of performance and improvement outside of physical practice itself. So the quality of feedback is very important in directing learners to improve.
Gotcha.
So taking like one step further from the statistical information is I'm wondering, and this is a big topic, so we can just kind of touch on it, but what information do athletes need to know? And what information do coaches need to know to keep to themselves? So what a meeting like this is, if an athlete could know everything about how they perform the skill, would that be the ideal? Or would there be some negative, like obviously it could just the obvious negatives of like you could overthink it, you could be too aware of what your body is doing. We touched on that, like the internal versus external sort of focus and control. But basically, like I kind of go back and forth between, it feels like there's some sort of balance here. And some learning is really well done when it's sort of like subconscious. Like you learn it without even realizing that you've done it. And behaviors and norms and all, whether it's just social habits or whether it's volleyball skills. There's a lot that must be learned subconsciously, like because we couldn't consciously learn this much stuff. But then I find that athletes that are, like, for lack of a better term, like sort of like highly subconscious, highly intuitive, they can struggle when they get in a rut because they don't know how to fix it. So I don't know if there's anything there besides just you have to find the right balance. But Dave or Strick, I'm wondering just what your thoughts are on where that balance is.
As far as, I think we're getting to this idea of explicit versus implicit learning.
Yep.
And explicit learning means I was told from an augmented source, meaning an external source, like a coach or the game rules have told me that I can only do a certain amount of things, versus an implicit source, which is by construction of the environment, I am learning how to do a task. So for instance, if a drill of 6-on-6 is like a wash game where it's a lot of transition attacking, I may get better implicitly just by the design of the game at transition footwork versus an explicit instruction of how to do the transition footwork, if that makes sense. And as far as what the literature says on this is that if you learn something implicitly, it is much more robust and much more, I wouldn't say powerful. Let's use powerful in the sense that you are able to replicate it underneath stress and it stays for a long period of time compared to an explicit source, which means a coach told me to hit sharp cross and I can only do it if he continues to give me those instructions to hit sharp cross. I can't do it on my own.
So here I want to unpack just a little bit beyond that, because I think there's something a little beyond just implicit versus explicit. And what I'm thinking of is like whether I've learned something implicitly or not. I guess what I would say is like, whether I've learned something implicitly or explicitly, have I learned it? Am I conscious of what I'm doing in order to perform the skill? Meaning, like, if we took a player who is performing the skill, like two twins that both can perform the skill at a high level, and one of them would be able to say, "Hey, how do you spike the ball that way?" And they'd be able to like pretty well recreate it. Well, my timing is like this, and then my approach is this many steps, and then I have this sort of arm swing. And then the other player, maybe if they tried to do the same thing, they wouldn't be able to accurately tell you like all of their body mechanics as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you kind of know what I'm saying there? Is like basically like how it's less, maybe even less about like how implicitly and explicitly they have learned it, but maybe how explicitly they could explain what they do.
Yeah, so I think what we're going towards is this idea, does declarative knowledge versus procedural knowledge translate to better learning? So declarative knowledge is just knowledge of the ability to explain a task in language. And procedural knowledge is the brain's way of doing the task. Like, can you explain to me declaratively how you ride a bicycle? Probably not. You just kind of get on there and you balance and you go, right? That's a procedure that you just know how to do. It's hard to explain. As far as what we would want from our athletes from a motor learning standpoint is we would want as much implicitly learned information as possible. Because once you start bringing in conscious control, you can really start going to internal focus attention real quickly. And so you'll get great athletes that get to experiment in high school, and then they get to coaches that try to explicitly tell them how to do all these things that they've already implicitly learned, and they'll get worse because there's now cognitive controls on their abilities that they didn't have before, constraining them from doing it optimally.
So I'm going to push back on that just a little bit, because I think that there's no question that an Olympic level player could tell you a lot more about their position, how they play the game, than your average high school player, for example. I don't know if they could always explain the game as much as an experienced coach, but sometimes that they can explain things about how they play that I wouldn't think about, for example. Or, you know, I'm constantly learning, I would say, from like the elite players that I coach. I think that every like top player that I coach, like there's always like just in addition to just watching them perform the skills, like obviously I'm always just like, what are the mechanics like? You know, what are their reads like? I'm always like watching them play, but just in like the conversations, like there always will be like just a throwaway phrase or the way they'll say something. I'm like, oh, I never quite thought of it that way, or that's a little bit different than how I thought. So that's, I guess, what I'm kind of trying to like think about is, so when you have this sort of, because all athletes go through slumps. So when I have that slump, you know, how much do I need to know what has changed, for example? If I was performing well and now I'm not performing well as an athlete, do I need to know what has changed? Or can I sort of like have some sort of implicit learning that can snap me out of it for better or worse?
For sure. I think this is a great point here. I want to bring some studies and data into this too. So there was a study done in the MLB about awareness of body mechanics or where the bat was located when they were trying to hit a ball when the players were in a slump. And what they found was that as batters were more aware of bat position, they performed worse. So as the awareness increased, those tensional resources were used for bat location instead of contacting the ball, which was the performance of batting. So I want to make sure that's in this construction of the argument too, that if the more aware of your body you are, the less attentional resources you can use to complete the task, like spiking a volleyball or passing a volleyball. All these things are tasks. As far as what you're going towards beyond the studies, I think as many times as we can give athletes an explicit information of how to complete the task is much more important than what is going wrong, because that's where they need to focus their attention, is how do I need to improve versus what's going not so great, because that doesn't help them change.
Right.
Joe, I would go back to what you were talking about in terms of being able to articulate something. From being around a lot of high level athletes, I think their ability to articulate comes from what they've been told by their coaches over the years, and isn't necessarily just their organic thought, but they've now attached the cues that coaches have told them to what they're doing. So if you were to poll maybe somebody that's been in Karch's gym for the last 4 years, my guess is how they would describe passing to you would be a lot like how Karch would try to describe how to pass to them. And I see that happen with young players in our gym a lot, is when I ask them to describe a skill as we watch together on video, a lot of times they just repeat maybe what they've been told over the last few months, because that's sort of the language they've been hearing. I don't know if it's organic thought. Maybe it's different when you have these national team players come to the gym that haven't been in the gym for a while. But my guess is their language is a lot like they hear in their college gym that they come from.
Those good thoughts. Good thoughts for sure.
No.
I think it's a tricky. It's tough because in a way, so you're describing kind of like almost like false declarative knowledge. So you're describing their ability to have some declarative knowledge that's maybe not quite accurate. Like they're, it's like when you have a player, they pass a ball and you're like, what, did you do it right that time? And they're like, yes. Like they're trying to judge based off your tone of voice, like what their answer should be. And it's like,
Yep.
No, all right, we need to restart from square one, because that's not what we're trying to accomplish here. It's not about like what I think. It's about like you understanding like what you're trying to do. So I think that's like one of the hardest tasks with players. And I wonder like how much I should be trying to do that. How much should I be trying to like teach them about the game, and how much should I be not teaching them at all and just having them perform the skill? It feels like there's something in between there, between the two extremes. I don't know if that's like a cop out on my part there, but I guess that's kind of one of the biggest things. Like how much do your players need? Like would their performance be helped if they had the knowledge of the game where they could step out and coach the game? Or would it not be helped, or would it even be hindered?
Right.
So that's kind of some of my thoughts on that. I don't know.
I want to answer that. I think that's if you'd let me hear.
Yeah, go for it.
I think that we need to make the distinction that great declarative teachers are not necessarily great procedural players. Like just because you're able to play well doesn't mean you can teach it well, and vice versa.
Andrew, if you've ever seen me play, you would know that for sure I'm more of a teacher.
So I don't think a player's ability to describe how they do what they do or be able to instruct someone else means that they're themselves not a great player at the game they play.
But for sure there is a correlation. It's nowhere near 1-to-1.
Mm-hmm.
But like your Olympic players have like way better knowledge than your average high school player, for example. I don't know if your Olympic player is going to be as good of a coach as your Olympic coach, but I for sure see that correlation. Now, just the question, and of course we've all seen that a lot of great coaches. It's rare that you see, like in any sport, NBA, NFL, volleyball. It's rare that you see a championship level coach that was not a player. Now, often some of the greatest coaches were, I'll call them good but not great players. Somebody like Belichick was not a great player or anything like that. I mean, Phil Jackson was a good player for sure. You have all these kind of examples. So it makes me wonder, is it random noise? Or just if you were a player, you were more likely to get your first job, easier. So then you had a higher a track on the coaching ladder, or is there something there? Or is it just the non-performance aspects of having a playing background that as a coach allows you to relate better to players, something like that. So but I definitely agree with you. It's not it's nowhere even close to 1-to-1. And if the correlation might be closer to 0 than 1, but I don't know, just wondering a little bit about some of these things and how that relates to us setting up our practice gyms. Like Dave, how much do you emphasize, like, kind of, or important do you feel it is to have your guys like understand what you understand from a coaching perspective, and how much is it just thinking about designing the training so that they can execute the skill? Do you know what I'm kind of?
Yeah. I don't really care if our guys can articulate anything. And you were around the guy that I was around for 10 plus years. Marv is probably the greatest at saying very little and letting the athletes perform and understanding what are the key elements of this to have the athletes perform. Now, what we'll spend a lot of time talking about is what's the element of practice that gets them to improve this the most. But I don't, going back to this idea of blocking, or even if it's something within our offense, right? There's an element of offense that we want to throw in, a wrinkle or whatever. Me and Andrew spoke a little bit this year about this constraint-led learning approach, and just we saw a lot of improvement. And that was after hours and hours of me sitting there trying to break it down with our athletes. And what we found is our athletes then became way too analytical on the court, trying to, he was here and I was there, and, versus just let's put them in an environment where they're going to do this a lot organically, and then let's let them learn. And the hardest part for us and our staff was removing ourselves and letting them try to problem solve on their own together. And I just keep thinking about how much of it just makes us feel good as coaches to insert ourselves and to talk and to articulate, and how much is it really helping the learning environment. And unfortunately, I hope the athletic director never listens to this, but probably not too much, in terms of these athletes. Some of the best athletes in our gym get better by just going out and playing on the beach with no coaches and just touching the ball a lot. And when we removed ourselves, we found our athletes improve. Now, maybe that's a motivation thing. Maybe that's they were hungry to do it because it was new. And so maybe there's some other factors there, but I just don't know. I don't care if they can articulate it at all, quite frankly, but I really would like them to perform it. And you saw that with some of the guys that you worked with when you were with us. Some of our best players couldn't tell you one thing about attacking, but they were really good attackers.
All right. Good perspective. Strick, last word.
Last word on the attacking?
On anything. You get the last word tonight.
Oh, right.
Don't tell him that, yeah. Check the clocks.
The constraint-led approach that David's talking about is relatively new in our literature of motor learning. It goes to what implicit learning can be used in. And I want to make sure I say this too about explicit learning, that if it's coming from an outside source like a coach directing the athlete, the one thing about explicit learning that's important is it's faster at getting immediate improvement than implicit learning, even though it's not as robust, meaning it doesn't last as long. So if I have a game coming up against CSUN, let's say, Cal State University Northridge, and they like to do their offense a certain way, I might explicitly tell our blocking how to set up against them to be successful explicitly, rather than design an implicit practice that takes longer for them to finally learn, because by game time, they may not have learned it. So I want to make sure that's set across the board.
Awesome. Good stuff there. And constraints-based learning is a topic that I really want to dive into, and I want to give it a little more time than the minute we have here. So that's maybe next week or something that we'll check back and we'll dive into that topic, because that's a really important one.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for joining, and thanks everybody for listening to another episode of the Volleycast. And check back tomorrow. We'll have more for you.
Thanks, Joe.
Take care.
Thanks.